Sitting outside the cafe with tears streaming down her cheeks, Sarah couldn't believe the sweet and kind man she married 2 years ago had turned out to be a monster who treated her like trash. Sarah was the only child of Mr. Davis, a wealthy businessman. At 25, Sarah was plus-sized, shy, and full of love for everyone around her. Her father often said, "You are my princess. One day, you will take over my company." When her father passed away, Sarah became the owner of his business empire. She wasn't sure how to run it, but her father's personal assistant, Mark, offered to help her. He was charming and seemed to care for her. "You don't have to worry, Sarah. I'll help you," he said one day with a kind smile. Over time, Mark became closer to Sarah. One day, he proposed. "Sarah, I love you. Will you marry me?" Overjoyed, Sarah said yes. She believed she had found someone who loved her for who she was. The wedding was grand, and Sarah felt like the luckiest woman in the world. But 6 months after the wedding, Mark began to change. "Sarah, you're too fat," he told her one evening. "You need to lose weight. People laugh at you." His words hurt her deeply, but she stayed silent. She loved him and didn't want to fight. Mark soon took full control of the company. "Let me handle the business," he said. "You don't know much about it." Sarah trusted him, but she noticed the company wasn't doing well. When she asked about it, Mark snapped, "Stop asking silly questions. Just stay at home." Sarah felt useless and unimportant. One afternoon, Sarah found an envelope on the dining table. Inside were divorce papers. Her hands shook as she read the words. When Mark came home that night, she confronted him. "Mark, what is this? Why do you want a divorce?" she cried. "I'm tired, Sarah. You're too fat." "Who wants an elephant for a wife?" he said coldly. Mark packed his things and left, leaving Sarah heartbroken. The next day, Sarah decided to visit her father's company. When she arrived, the gates were locked. A security guard told her, "Madam, the company is closed. Mark sold everything." "What?" Sarah exclaimed. She couldn't believe it. "I heard Mark opened a new one," he added. "They're launching it today at the Grand Hotel." Sarah's heart broke even more. Mark had betrayed her and now he was celebrating his new company. That evening, Sarah went to the Grand Hotel. The hall was filled with people. She spotted Mark on stage, laughing and holding a glass of champagne. Beside him was Emily, her best friend. Mark suddenly took Emily's hand. "Emily, will you marry me?" he said loudly. The crowd cheered as Emily smiled and said yes. Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She stepped forward and shouted, "Mark, how could you do this to me?" Mark turned, shocked to see her, but instead of answering, he smirked and walked towards her. "You're embarrassing yourself," he said. "You stole my father's company," Sarah shouted. "And now you're with my best friend." Mark laughed. "Your father's company? You mean the one you were too fat to manage before?" Before Sarah could reply, Mark slapped her across the face. The crowd gasped. "Security," he shouted. "Take this whale out of here." Tears streamed down Sarah's face as the guards dragged her out of the hall. Sitting outside the cafe, Sarah wiped her tears. She thought about her father's words, "You are my princess. I will not let this defeat me," she said to herself. "You will pay for this, Mark," she whispered to herself. As Sarah sat outside the cafe, wiping her tears after being humiliated, a familiar voice called out, "Sarah, is that you?" She looked up to see David, her childhood friend. He had been invited to the event as a guest. David was now a billionaire and a successful businessman, but he still recognized Sarah instantly. "David," Sarah said, surprised. "Yes, it's me. What happened? You look so upset," David asked concerned. Sarah broke down and explained everything, her marriage to Mark, the betrayal, and the humiliation she had just faced. David listened quietly. "You shouldn't go home in this state," David said after a moment. "Let me take you to my place." Too heartbroken to argue, Sarah nodded. David's mansion was grand, but it felt warm and welcoming. He led Sarah to the living room and made her a cup of tea. "Do you remember how we used to climb oak trees as kids?" David asked, trying to lighten the mood. Sarah managed a small smile. "Yes, and you always got scared of the bees," she replied. They talked about their childhood, and David tried his best to cheer her up. "You're stronger than this, Sarah. Don't let Mark's actions define you," he said gently. That night, Sarah slept in the guest room, feeling a small sense of comfort for the first time in months. The next day, Sarah returned to her house, hoping to sort things out. To her shock, she found the gates locked and her belongings scattered outside. A neighbor informed her that Mark had sold the house. Heartbroken and with nowhere else to go, Sarah gathered her things and returned to David's house. When Sarah arrived at David's house, she was overwhelmed with emotion. She couldn't stop crying, and to cope, she started searching for food. She opened cupboards, the fridge, and even drawers, looking for anything to eat. David found her in the kitchen, holding a packet of herbal concoctions. "What's this, Sarah?" David asked, sniffing. David smiled. "That's a special concoction my mom used to drink. She used to be a curvy woman, but this, combined with her diet plan, helped her lose a lot of weight." Sarah looked at the concoction thoughtfully. "Do you think it could help me?" she asked. "It helped my mom. I'm sure it will help you if you combine it with a healthy diet," David said. "I'll do it," Sarah said firmly. From that moment, Sarah decided to change her life. She started taking the concoction, followed the diet plan, and with David's encouragement, began her journey to rebuild her confidence and regain control of her life. Months passed, and Sarah worked hard to transform herself. She followed David's diet plan, took the herbal tea religiously, and exercised daily. Slowly but surely, she began to lose weight. One morning, as Sarah looked in the mirror, she couldn't believe what she saw. The woman staring back at her was slim, beautiful, and confident. She smiled for the first time in a long time. "Sarah, you look amazing," David said proudly. "Thank you, David," Sarah replied. "I feel like a new person." David had an upcoming business event and decided to take Sarah along. Lots of business tycoons would be attending, including Sarah's ex-husband, Mark. "Yes, I think it's time to teach that Mark a lesson," Sarah said. "But you will have to introduce me as your sister," Sarah said. David replied with a wink. He wanted to help Sarah get her revenge on Mark. The event was grand, filled with powerful business tycoons from all over the country. David and Sarah arrived together, and heads turned as Sarah walked in, wearing a sleek, elegant dress. She looked stunning, her confidence shining through. As they mingled, Sarah's eyes landed on someone she recognized immediately, Mark. He was standing in a corner, talking to a group of people. Mark's eyes soon caught Sarah, and he froze. She was breathtaking, but he didn't recognize her. "David, who's the beautiful lady with you?" Mark asked, walking over. "This is Emily," David said, smiling. "She's my sister. She just returned from studying abroad." Mark couldn't take his eyes off her. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Emily," he said, extending his hand. Sarah shook his hand and gave a small smile. "The pleasure is mine," she replied calmly. As the night went on, Mark couldn't stop thinking about Sarah. Her beauty, poise, and charm left him mesmerized. Later, Sarah approached Mark and said, "I heard about your company. It's impressive. I'd love to work with someone as brilliant as you." Mark's ego swelled. "You want to work for me?" he asked, surprised. Yes, Sarah replied with a soft smile. I'd love to be your personal assistant. Mark hesitated for a moment. He wanted to appear important to David, and hiring David's sister seemed like a good move. Consider it done, Mark said, smiling. Sarah smirked inwardly. The stage was set. She was determined to make Mark pay for all the pain he had caused her. Sarah joined Mark's company as his personal assistant. She was efficient, polite, and seemed genuinely caring. She brought Mark coffee every morning, helped organize his schedule, and even stayed late to help him. With work. Megan, you're amazing, Mark told her one evening. I don't know how I manage without you. Just doing my job, Maureen said with a soft smile, but inside she was playing her part perfectly. Tina, Mark's wife, began to notice how much time Mark spent with Sarah. She didn't like it. Why does she have to stay so late? Tina asked one night. She's helping me with work, Mark replied annoyed. She's more supportive than you are. Tina's face turned red with anger, but she said nothing. Sarah made it a point to be kind to Mark in ways Tina never was. Mark, you look stressed. Have you eaten? Sarah asked one afternoon, placing a plate of food on his desk. Mark smiled. You're always so thoughtful, Megan. Tina, who happened to walk into the office at that moment, glared at the scene. What is this? She's feeding you now. Tina snapped. Mark rolled his eyes. Tina, not everything is about you. Megan is just being nice. You're spending too much time with her, Tina shouted. Maybe if you were as caring as she is, we wouldn't be arguing all the time, Mark shot back. Tina stormed out of the office fuming. The fights between Mark and Tina grew worse every day. You don't even notice me anymore, Tina yelled one night at home. Because all you do is complain, Tina, Mark snapped. Megan makes me feel appreciated. Megan, Megan, Megan. Is that all you care about now? Tina screamed. Maybe it is, Mark said coldly. Tina was furious, but she could see the change in Mark. He was slipping away from her, and Sarah was the reason. Mark found himself thinking about Sarah more and more. Her kindness, her beauty, her smile, everything about her made him feel alive. One evening, he couldn't hold back any longer. Megan, he said softly as she was packing up for the day. Yes, Mark, she replied, looking up at him. I don't know what I'd do without you, he said, stepping closer. You've changed my life. Sarah gave him a shy smile. I'm just happy to help, Mark. It's more than that, Mark said, reaching for her hand. You're special, Megan. Sarah pulled her hand away gently. Mark, you're married. I don't want to cause problems. Don't worry about Tina, Mark said firmly. She doesn't deserve me. She's toxic and jealous. I'll divorce her if that's what it takes. Sarah looked at him with a mix of pity and satisfaction. You should think carefully about what you're saying, she said, her voice calm, but deep inside she knew her plan was working perfectly. Mark was falling into her trap, and she was one step closer to her ultimate revenge. Meanwhile, whenever Sarah was with David, she remained herself. David had started noticing something was off. Sarah, David said one evening when they were having dinner, you've been spending a lot of time with Mark. Are you sure this is still about revenge? Sarah smiled lightly. Bobby, I know what I'm doing. Trust me. But David didn't feel reassured. He realized he was starting to feel something deeper for Sarah. The thought of her spending so much time with Mark made him uneasy. At the office, Sarah continued her act. She brought him lunch, worked late with him, and always greeted him with a warm smile. Mark couldn't hide his growing feelings for Sarah. He started avoiding Tina at home, choosing to stay longer at the office just to be around Sarah. One evening, Mark even cancelled dinner plans with Tina to stay at work with Sarah. Tina showed up at the office furious. "Mark, what is this? You're canceling plans with me to stay with her?" Tina shouted. "Her name is Megan," Mark said annoyed. "I don't care what her name is," Tina yelled. "She's ruining our marriage." Mark rolled his eyes. "Maybe our marriage is already ruined because of you, Tina. Megan is more supportive than you'll ever be." Tina stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind her. Back at David's mansion, Sarah was unwinding after another day of her charade. David joined her in the living room, watching her quietly. "You seem so calm about everything," David said. "Doesn't it bother you being around that man after everything he did to you?" Sarah sighed. "It's not easy, David, but I'm not the same person I was before. I have control now." David hesitated before speaking. "What if you're playing with fire? What if he hurts you again?" Sarah reached out and held David's hand. "He can't hurt me anymore, David. I promise." Though her words reassured him, David couldn't help feeling jealous. He wanted to be the one Sarah turned to, not just for support but for love. Mark's company had been struggling, but hope came when his manager brought in a huge business deal. It was a contract worth millions, and closing it would save the company from financial ruin. Mark worked tirelessly on it, his mind consumed by the potential success. However, Sarah saw an opportunity. She knew this deal was critical for Mark's reputation and company, and she planned to use it to bring him down. The perfect chance came when Tina showed up at Mark's office once again, yelling and causing a scene. "Why is this Megan woman still here?" Tina screamed. "You care more about her than your own wife." "Tina, not now," Mark said, exasperated as the fight escalated. Sarah, who was standing at a corner in the room, waited for the perfect moment and slipped the important contract into Tina's handbag without anyone noticing. Then she quietly walked out, a satisfied smile on her face. The next morning, news broke that the details of Mark's big deal had been leaked. The investors were furious, accusing him of being careless and unprofessional. The deal fell through, and Mark was left scrambling to control the damage. Who could have done this? Mark asked in frustration during a meeting with his team. Sarah sat quietly, pretending to look concerned. "Maybe someone got their hands on the contract," she suggested innocently. The investors began withdrawing their support, leaving Mark under immense pressure. Late that night, Mark sat alone in his office, his head in his hands. Sarah entered with a tray of coffee and Mark's favorite snacks. "Mark, you shouldn't be so hard on yourself," she said softly, placing the tray on his desk. Mark looked up at her, his eyes tired. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Megan. You're the only one who understands me." Sarah smiled gently and sat down beside him. "You'll get through this. I believe in you." Mark reached out and took her hand. "You're amazing, Megan. I don't think I've ever met anyone like you." As their eyes met, Mark leaned closer. "You make me feel alive," he whispered, leaning in to kiss her. Sarah turned her head at the last moment, pulling away. "Mark, I can't." "Why not?" Mark asked, confused. "You're married," Sarah replied softly. Mark's face hardened. "Tina doesn't deserve me. She's toxic and jealous. I'll divorce her if that's what it takes." Sarah looked at him with a mix of pity and satisfaction. "You should think carefully about what you're saying," she said, her voice calm, but deep inside she knew her plan was working perfectly. Mark was falling into her trap, and she was one step closer to her ultimate revenge. However, Sarah's plan was about to take an unexpected turn. David, who had been observing the situation closely, decided to intervene. He couldn't stand to see Sarah continue down this path of manipulation and revenge. He knew she deserved true happiness, not a life built on deceit. One evening, David confronted Sarah. "Sarah," he said, his voice serious, "I can't let you continue this. You're hurting yourself more than you're hurting him. Sarah looked at him, surprised. What are you talking about, David? She asked, trying to maintain her composure. I know what you're doing, Sarah, David said, his voice firm. You're playing a dangerous game. You're using Mark to get back at him, but in the process, you're losing yourself. Sarah's facade began to crumble. I just wanted to make him pay, she admitted, her voice trembling. I wanted him to feel the pain he caused me. David took her hands in his. I understand your anger, Sarah. But revenge will only consume you. You deserve more than this. You deserve to be happy, truly happy. Sarah looked at David, her eyes filled with tears. She realized that David was right. She had been so consumed by her desire for revenge that she had forgotten about her own happiness.